I did.
No, this is wonderful. I mean, you talk about we're covering memory, which is what history is in so
Yeah.
many ways. And you point out in your book that the terror bombings actually began prior to the U.S. entry into World War II. That the Japanese bombed Chinese cities, the Germans bombed Guernica, even the Zeppelins in World War I were a form of terror bombing, and they were universally condemned as terror bombing. And yet, as the war progresses, the Allied powers do precisely that. And can you talk about the cultural shift that takes place?
Yeah, that many years ago in the 1980s, I finished a book which was about the U.S. and Japan, the World War II in the Asia Pacific. And I called it War Without Mercy. And I almost got into that book by accident. We often stumble into our projects by accident. I sat down to write a book about Japan after World War II, and I started out, I said, I got to write a few paragraphs about, the war and the prelude, because it was wonderful that Japan and America became friends and allies after the war. This was wonderful because it was such a horrid war. And then I said, I better write a few paragraphs about the war. And then the paragraphs became a chapter, and the chapter became a book. And I called it War Without Mercy. And one of the things that was stunning to me at the time was to go back into the response of the Western world to the terror bombing, the targeting of civilians by the Germans and the Japanese in the late 1930s. And our most famous recollection of that in the West, probably most burned into our minds, is Picasso's Guernica, which was the bombing in Spain of civilian community, which was the bombing in Spain of a civilian community. The most famous photograph that convinced us that the Japanese were barbaric, and which is reproduced in Cultures of War, is a photo of a Chinese baby sitting in a bombed-out railway station in Shanghai in 1937. And many people have called that the most powerful propaganda photo of the war in Asia, because that was what made the Americans say they are barbaric, unlike ourselves. And what was fascinating at the time for me as a young researcher was to go in and read the condemnation of German bombing and fascist bombing and Japanese bombing of civilians by the League of Nations, by the United States President and State Department. The U.S. wasn't in the League, by Winston Churchill and the British government, and it's very explicit. Deliberately targeting civilians is beyond the pale of civilization. This is barbaric behavior. And then a great sea change took place as America became involved in the war in Europe first, as the British began to regain an offensive against the Germans, and as the concepts of strategic warfare began to develop, and as concepts of psychological warfare and total war began to be concretely expanded, that it is not enough to just go in and target factories and military-related industry. It's not even efficient. It's very hard to hit those targets. So we've really got to do carpet bombing in these areas, but also psychologically this will destroy the morale of the enemy, because the fighting force, knowing that the wife and children and family back home is being destroyed, will be demoralized. The people will withdraw their support from the government, and doing that will also boost the morale of our side. And so this became a standard, ingrained part of the war in Europe. And then the British led it, the Americans participated in it in Europe. They were deliberately going after urban areas. Those were the targets written, the urban area of this city or that city. Then they would rewrite them somewhat for public relations. We were attacking the railway station in City X or the shipyards in City Y. But the reports were clearly urban targeting. Then it moves to Japan, and the Americans very early begin alone in Japan to target the cities. Now, while this is going on, the Americans were, and this was something that comes up in this book, were doing their experiments in how to develop napalm and how to develop fire bombs, and they begin doing these experiments in 1943 and 1944, and they do particularly in Dugway Proving Grounds in Utah, and they bring in people to reconstruct the homes of ordinary German and ordinary Japanese workers. And this is way before the news of Bataan, and this is way before, this is beginning very early in the war, because there is a momentum in this thinking. We have this capacity. And they bring in people to recreate, in the case of Japan, workers' homes that are like the workers' homes in Japanese cities. And they actually go to the extent of bringing in tatami straw mats from Hawaii, putting in zabuton cushions that people sit on in the houses, recreating the storm doors and testing what it's like when the explosion takes place, when they're open, what it's like when they're closed, trying to find wood that is as close as possible to the kind of cypress and other fir trees that the Japanese used, getting stucco that is as close as possible from the Southwest, as close as possible to Japanese stucco. They are making workers' homes, ordinary people's homes. This isn't collateral damage. This is part of the deliberate targeting. So, in doing this book, there's been quite a bit of writing in Europe about the air war in Europe. None of this has anything to do with minimizing the atrocities of Hitler or the Holocaust. It's just the way war was conducted. And the numbers, you can never get the numbers, but the best numbers for Europe are 400 to 600,000 civilians were killed in the Anglo-American air raids. I did, mostly from American documents, I did the same kind of calculations for Japan. The 60-plus cities that are bombed before Hiroshima, Nagasaki, plus Hiroshima, Nagasaki, the numbers come out roughly the same. About 400 to 600,000 civilians were killed in the air war in Japan. So your total figure is about 1 million civilians were bombed in those two wars, culminating in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Had I been living at the time, I have no reason to think I wouldn't have supported that. But when we suddenly learn that terror bombing, or hear that terror bombing is something peculiar to an alien culture, that it's those people who don't respect individuals, whereas we do, that they have different standards, I think then that's where we have to really start asking deeper questions.
And yet to take an 18-year-old, whether it's a US or Japanese or German or Chinese, and be able to turn that 18-year-old into someone who is capable of doing really horrific things to complete strangers for reasons of state is a very unnatural act. It takes a lot of conditioning. And so there's a lot of dehumanization that goes on, both of the perpetrator as well as the victim. And I think this carries over into the way, in order to do these things, you have to dehumanize. But if you dehumanize, you can't really get into the mindset of your adversaries. And if you can't get into their mindset, you can't understand what's motivating them. If you don't understand what motivates them, you can't get them to stop doing whatever it is that you went to war to get them to stop doing in the first place. And so could you talk about that process of misunderestimation of the psychology of the adversary, if I can quote President Bush, and how that impacts the war, not just World War II, but the wars in Iraq post 9/11, the way we approach our adversaries and that mentality.
Well,